For years, the disappearance of Summer Wells has been surrounded by noise, speculation, and unanswered questions. But beneath the surface, this case has continued to move in ways the public rarely sees. While many believed the investigation had stalled, law enforcement quietly maintained control, choosing restraint over visibility. Then, years later, something unexpected happened. Investigators returned to the field, not to the Wells property, but to a remote stretch of land on Van Hill Road. No dramatic announcement, no detailed explanation. Just action. That single search raised a critical question. Why now? Late-stage excavations are not routine, and they are never random. According to official statements, the search followed up on a specific lead, with assistance connected to federal resources. This video does not assign blame or repeat rumors. Instead, it examines what the Van Hill Road search reveals about how this case is truly being handled, and why silence in investigations like this can be far more deliberate than it appears. When Summer Wells disappeared, the case immediately drew national attention. An Amber Alert was issued, search teams flooded the area, and multiple agencies became involved. Yet as days turned into months, public visibility faded. Many assumed the investigation slowed or stalled. Officially, however, authorities maintained a consistent position. The case remained active. What changed was not the effort, but the strategy, shifting from open searches to controlled, behind-the-scenes work. According to statements from the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, assistance from federal authorities began early in the case. This detail is often misunderstood. Federal assistance does not automatically mean federal leadership. In many missing child investigations, state agencies retain control while federal resources provide analytical and technical support. This structure limits what can be publicly disclosed and explains why updates became increasingly rare over time. Public frustration grew as press conferences stopped and visible search efforts declined. Online discussions began to frame silence as an action. But investigators rarely operate for public reassurance. Once initial search phases conclude, cases often enter a quieter stage, focused on data review, timeline reconstruction, and lead verification. These steps are slow, methodical, and almost entirely invisible to the public eye. The article emphasizes that law enforcement never classified this case as cold. That distinction matters. A cold case typically lacks active leads or resources. In contrast, authorities continued to state that tips were being reviewed and information was still coming in. Silence, in this context, was not abandonment. It was a controlled investigative posture designed to protect the integrity of ongoing work. One key factor often overlooked is jurisdiction. Summer Wells vanished within state boundaries, and without confirmed evidence of interstate movement, federal jurisdiction remains limited. This explains why some expected actions, such as federal listings or nationwide bulletins, did not occur. Investigators must meet specific legal thresholds before expanding beyond state authority, regardless of public expectation. As time passed, the case became increasingly shaped by public narratives rather than official facts. Speculation filled gaps left by the lack of updates. The article notes that this environment can complicate investigations, as false leads and misinformation consume valuable resources. Law enforcement agencies must then balance transparency with the risk of amplifying unverified claims. Despite the noise, investigative work continued quietly. Authorities reviewed timelines, reevaluated witness statements, and assessed new information as it emerged. These steps rarely produce immediate, shareable outcomes. Instead, they build a foundation for future action. In long-term cases, progress is often measured internally, not through public announcements. The article highlights that missing child investigations can remain active for years without visible milestones. Unlike cases with immediate physical evidence, investigations relying on indirect information require patience. Each new tip must be corroborated, filtered, and assessed for credibility. Most do not lead anywhere, but one credible lead can change everything. That reality helps explain why authorities are cautious with language. Phrases like "following up on a lead" are deliberately vague. They acknowledge activity without confirming outcomes. This protects investigative flexibility and prevents individuals connected to the case from adjusting behavior based on what law enforcement reveals publicly. Importantly, silence also protects potential witnesses. In some cases, individuals may hesitate to come forward until years later when circumstances change. Keeping investigative details limited reduces pressure and allows new information to surface organically. The article suggests this long-view approach has shaped how the Summer Wells case has been handled. The lack of updates has often been interpreted as failure. But investigative success is not defined by speed. Many cases experience long periods of quiet before significant developments occur. Authorities understand that premature disclosure can permanently damage a case, especially when evidence is limited or circumstantial. According to reporting, agencies involved remained in communication, sharing data and analysis as needed. This interagency cooperation is rarely visible to the public. It happens through internal channels, not press briefings. The effectiveness of this process cannot be measured by headlines, only by investigative readiness. The article also points out that missing child cases are emotionally charged, which increases public demand for answers. While understandable, this pressure does not change investigative standards. Law enforcement must operate within legal and procedural boundaries, regardless of external urgency. As years passed, some observers questioned whether new information could still emerge. Historically, many long-term cases have advanced due to delayed tips, technological improvements, or reanalysis of existing data. Time does not always weaken an investigation. Sometimes it strengthens it. The handling of the Summer Wells case reflects this reality. Rather than closing the file or reducing it to archival status, authorities maintained an active framework. Resources were adjusted, not removed. The absence of constant updates does not indicate inactivity, only discretion. The article stresses that investigators must consider the long-term implications of every public statement. Once information is released, it cannot be taken back. Silence allows law enforcement to control timing, context, and accuracy when developments occur. This controlled approach often clashes with public perception. Viewers are accustomed to rapid developments portrayed in media. Real investigations rarely follow that pattern. They advance unevenly, with long periods of review followed by brief moments of action. Understanding this gap between expectation and reality is critical. Without it, silence becomes misinterpreted, and restraint is mistaken for indifference. The article argues that this misunderstanding has shaped much of the discourse surrounding the case. What remains consistent is the official position. The case is active. Information is still being assessed, and investigators have not walked away. These statements, while limited, align with standard practices in long-term missing child investigations. Before examining later developments, including renewed investigative actions, it is essential to understand this foundation. The quiet years were not empty years. They were years of controlled, deliberate work, the kind that rarely draws attention, but often sets the stage for what comes next. Years after Summer Wells vanished, investigators quietly returned to the field. This time, the focus was not her home or the immediate surrounding area. Instead, law enforcement conducted a targeted search on Van Hill Road, several miles away. The location itself surprised many observers. It was not previously associated with early search efforts, which immediately raised questions about why it had become relevant so much later. According to official statements, the search was carried out as part of a follow-up on a lead. Authorities emphasized that the action was not random and not routine. Late-stage searches involving excavation require planning, authorization, and justification. They also require resources that are not deployed without reason. This alone distinguishes the Van Hill Road operation from earlier, broader search efforts. The article notes that heavy equipment was used during the search. This detail is significant. Excavation is not conducted unless investigators believe there is a reasonable chance that something beneath the surface may be relevant to the case. Even then, such actions are limited to specific areas, indicating that the location had been narrowed through prior analysis rather than guesswork. Law enforcement agencies involved did not publicly disclose the source of the lead. However, reporting confirmed that federal assistance played a role in the investigative process connected to this search. This does not imply federal control of the case, but it does suggest that advanced analytical resources were involved in evaluating the information that led investigators to Van Hill Road. Importantly, authorities were careful with their wording. They did not describe the site as a crime scene, nor did they characterize the search as evidence of wrongdoing. The language used remained neutral and procedural. This distinction matters, as it reinforces that the purpose of the search was information gathering, not confirmation of a specific theory. After the operation concluded, law enforcement did not announce any findings. No confirmation, no denial, and no further explanation followed. For the public, this silence was frustrating. But the article explains that silence after a search is common practice, especially when revealing outcomes could compromise investigative strategy or influence individuals connected to the case. One misconception addressed in the article is the belief that a lack of results means the search failed. In reality, a search can provide value even when nothing is publicly reported. It can eliminate possibilities, confirm or rule out locations, and refine future investigative focus. These outcomes are rarely shared, but they are critical internally. The timing of the Van Hill Road search is another key factor. Conducting such an operation years later suggests that information emerged long after the initial disappearance. In many cases, tips or data do not surface immediately. Changes in relationships, circumstances, or memory can prompt individuals to come forward well after an event occurred. The article highlights that delayed information is not unusual in long-term investigations. People may hesitate to speak for personal reasons, or they may not realize the significance of what they know until much later. When such information reaches investigators and meets credibility thresholds, it can trigger renewed physical searches. The controlled nature of the Van Hill Road operation further supports this interpretation. The search was limited in scope, conducted over a defined period, and executed without public spectacle. This suggests careful planning rather than urgency driven by external pressure or media attention. Authorities also declined to answer follow-up questions beyond their initial statement. While this approach often fuels speculation, the article explains that limiting communication preserves investigative leverage. Once specific details are made public, they cannot be undone, and they may affect how future information is evaluated. Another point emphasized is that investigators must consider how public statements could influence potential witnesses. Declaring that a search produced no results could discourage someone from sharing related information, believing it is no longer relevant. Silence keeps investigative avenues open. The involvement of federal resources, even in a supporting role, indicates that the lead was subjected to higher-level scrutiny before action was taken. This review process helps prevent unnecessary searches and ensures that physical interventions are based on more than unverified claims. The article cautions against interpreting the Van Hill Road search as confirmation of any specific outcome. A search reflects possibility, not conclusion. It represents a step in a larger process, not the final word on what happened or where answers may lie. Public reaction to the search demonstrated how expectations often differ from investigative reality. Many anticipated immediate answers or dramatic revelations. Instead, they encountered restraint. This gap between expectation and practice has shaped much of the conversation around the case. From an investigative standpoint, the search demonstrates continued commitment. A case that is truly inactive does not receive renewed physical operations years later. While results were not shared, the decision to act reflects ongoing evaluation and responsiveness to new information. The article also notes that law enforcement agencies must manage limited resources across many cases. Choosing to allocate personnel and equipment to a specific location indicates prioritization. That choice alone signals that the case remains active within official frameworks. It is also important to recognize what the search does not tell us. It does not establish timelines, responsibility, or outcomes. It simply confirms that investigators are still pursuing leads as they arise, regardless of how much time has passed. Understanding the Van Hill Road search requires patience and context. Without that, silence becomes misinterpreted as secrecy for its own sake. The article argues that restraint is often a deliberate tool, not a sign of failure or indifference. As the case continues, the Van Hill Road search stands as a reminder that investigations evolve quietly. Developments may occur without explanation, and answers may not come quickly. What matters most is that the process continues, even when it happens far from public view. As the investigation into Summer Wells continued quietly, a different force grew louder: the Internet. Online discussions, commentary channels, and social media platforms began to fill the silence left by limited official updates. What started as concern slowly transformed into judgment, often without access to verified information or investigative context. The article describes how public attention shifted away from facts and toward narrative. In the absence of regular updates, speculation became the default. Questions turned into assumptions, and assumptions hardened into beliefs. Over time, these beliefs shaped how many people viewed the case, regardless of what law enforcement had actually confirmed. One of the most significant consequences was how focus moved toward the parents. Online conversations increasingly framed them as central figures, not based on evidence presented by authorities, but on interpretation of interviews, body language, and personal history. These interpretations circulated widely, often detached from official findings. The article emphasizes a critical point. Law enforcement never publicly named suspects or announced charges. Yet, in online spaces, conclusions were often treated as settled. This disconnect between official restraint and public certainty created a parallel version of the case, one driven by perception rather than process. Media coverage played a role in amplifying this shift. Headlines framed silence as suspicion, and repetition reinforced doubt. While journalists reported accurately on the lack of updates, the cumulative effect was a narrative that implied stagnation or concealment, even when no such claims were made by investigators. The article highlights how emotionally charged cases involving children are especially vulnerable to this dynamic. Public empathy demands answers, and when answers are delayed, frustration seeks an outlet. Online platforms provide that outlet, but they rarely reward patience or nuance. As commentary intensified, the line between analysis and accusation blurred. Opinions were often presented as conclusions. This environment made it increasingly difficult for facts to stand on their own, as they competed with speculation that spread faster and wider than verified information. The article raises an uncomfortable question. What happens when the public narrative is wrong? In cases where investigations take years, early assumptions can solidify long before evidence emerges. When that happens, correcting the record becomes nearly impossible, regardless of the truth. Another concern addressed is the impact on potential witnesses. Individuals who might hold relevant information could hesitate to come forward if they fear becoming targets of online scrutiny. In that sense, public judgment does not just exist alongside investigations, it can actively interfere with them. The article notes that law enforcement agencies are aware of this risk. This awareness further explains their cautious communication strategy. By limiting public detail, investigators attempt to prevent misinformation from shaping behavior, even though that same silence can fuel speculation. Over time, the case became less about finding answers and more about reinforcing existing beliefs. Online communities formed around specific interpretations, and dissenting views were often dismissed. This echo chamber effect hardened narratives that were never confirmed by evidence. The article draws attention to a troubling possibility that the internet may have turned the wrong people into villains. While this cannot be confirmed or denied without resolution, the damage caused by public accusation is real and lasting, regardless of investigative outcomes. This phenomenon is not unique to this case. The article places the Summer-Wells investigation within a broader pattern seen in other high-profile disappearances, where public speculation outpaces official findings and reshapes perception long before facts emerge. In such cases, silence from authorities is often misread as complicity or failure. But investigators must weigh the cost of speaking against the cost of remaining quiet. Every statement has consequences, especially when public opinion is already polarized. The article suggests that restraint is sometimes the only way to protect the integrity of an investigation. Revealing partial information to satisfy public curiosity can permanently damage a case, especially if that information is misunderstood or taken out of context. As years pass, the internet rarely revisits its conclusions. Narratives remain fixed, even as circumstances change. This creates a lasting shadow over everyone connected to the case, independent of what future evidence may show. The emotional toll of this process is rarely acknowledged. Families, witnesses, and even investigators operate under constant scrutiny. The article argues that this pressure complicates an already difficult search for truth. Understanding this context is essential when evaluating the current state of the case. Public perception is not evidence. Online consensus is not resolution. And silence does not equal certainty. The article ultimately challenges viewers to reconsider how they engage with unresolved cases. Consuming speculation as entertainment may feel harmless, but its consequences can extend far beyond the screen. As the Summer-Wells case continues, one truth remains clear: the loudest voices are not always the most informed. Until facts emerge, restraint, both from investigators and the public, may be the only responsible path forward. As the Summer-Wells case enters another year without public resolution, attention shifts from immediate events to long-term implications. The article emphasizes that unresolved cases do not simply pause with time. They continue to exist within investigative systems, revisited as new information, technology, or context becomes available. Law enforcement agencies involved have consistently maintained that the case remains active. While this statement may feel repetitive, it carries practical meaning. An active case continues to receive review, data maintenance, and responsiveness to new tips, even if no visible actions occur for extended periods. The article explains that long-term investigations often depend on patience rather than momentum. Breakthroughs rarely follow predictable timelines. Instead, they emerge when conditions change, when someone speaks, when records are re-examined, or when new analytical tools become available. Advances in technology play a quiet but important role. Improved data analysis, mapping tools, and record integration allow investigators to revisit old information with fresh perspective. Details once considered insignificant can take on new relevance years later. The article notes that time can alter human behavior. Relationships shift, loyalties change, and memories resurface. Individuals who once stayed silent may eventually feel compelled to share information. This reality is why investigators rarely close the door entirely on unresolved cases. Another factor discussed is institutional memory. Maintaining continuity over years requires careful documentation and case management. When investigators change roles or retire, the case file must preserve clarity so future teams can understand past decisions without distortion. Public interest, while intense early on, often fades with time. The article suggests this decline can be a double-edged sword. Reduced attention lowers pressure, but may also create space for witnesses to come forward without fear of immediate exposure. At the same time, the digital footprint of the case remains permanent. Online content, commentary, and speculation do not disappear. This persistent record can influence how future developments are interpreted, regardless of their accuracy. The article highlights the importance of separating documentation from interpretation. Official records are preserved as evidence. Public narratives, however, are not bound by the same standards. Over time, the two can diverge dramatically. For investigators, this divergence presents a challenge. Any future update will enter an environment shaped by years of assumption. Communicating clearly, carefully, and responsibly becomes even more critical as time passes. The article also discusses the emotional dimension of unresolved cases. Closure is not only a legal outcome, but a psychological one. Without answers, uncertainty persists for families, communities, and even those working the case. Yet the absence of closure does not eliminate responsibility. Authorities remain obligated to assess new information objectively, regardless of how much time has passed or how public attention has shifted. The case also raises broader questions about how society engages with missing child investigations. The article suggests that empathy must be balanced with restraint, and curiosity must be guided by respect for due process. One of the most important lessons is that visibility does not equal progress. Investigations can advance quietly, and sometimes must do so to remain effective. Public silence is not proof of inactivity. The article urges readers to reconsider assumptions about timing. Justice and answers do not follow schedules. Some cases resolve quickly, others take years, and some require circumstances no one can predict. As resources are allocated across many cases, prioritization does not mean neglect. It reflects strategic decision-making within limited capacity. The choice to continue evaluating this case indicates it still matters within official frameworks. The long-term handling of the Summer Wells case reflects a system designed to endure, not rush. While this approach can be frustrating, it exists to protect accuracy and integrity rather than satisfy immediate demand. The article concludes that unresolved does not mean forgotten. Records remain, leads remain open, and the possibility of future development remains real, even if distant. Understanding this reality requires patience from the public and discipline from institutions. The search for answers is not always visible, but it does not stop simply because time passes. As the case moves forward, its outcome remains unknown. What is clear is that the process continues, shaped by caution, responsibility, and the recognition that some truths take far longer to emerge than anyone expects. The Summer Wells case reminds us that real investigations rarely unfold the way we expect. There are no constant updates, no dramatic conclusions on demand, and no clear timelines for answers. What we see from the outside is often only a fraction of what is happening behind closed doors. Silence can feel uncomfortable, but in complex cases, it is sometimes the space where careful work continues, unseen, methodical, and restrained. As time passes, it becomes easier to confuse repetition with stagnation and quiet with failure. But investigations are not performances. They are built on verification, not visibility. The absence of public detail does not erase effort, and it does not mean a case has been forgotten. It means decisions are being made cautiously, with long-term consequences in mind, rather than short-term reaction. At True Child Cases, we focus on understanding how these investigations actually work, not how rumors portray them. We examine structure, process, and verified information without assigning blame or feeding speculation. If you value patience over panic, analysis over accusation, and facts over narratives, this channel is built for you. If you believe missing child cases deserve clarity, responsibility, and respect, consider subscribing to True Child Cases. Each video is created to inform, not inflame, to explain, not accuse. Because when answers take time, the way we talk about these cases matters just as much as the answers themselves.